Hello and welcome to the Kingdom Strength podcast. My name is Dr. Troy Briscoe, your host. And as a little reminder, the Kingdom Strength podcast is a podcast where we discuss a variety of topics ranging from exercise science, training, education, clinical concepts with chiropractic and patient care, as well as the Christian walk, the scriptures, Bible studies. So if you're interested in any of that, you are in the right place. Thank you for tuning in today. Today we are discussing marathon training. The title of this podcast will be The Biggest Mistakes in Marathon Training and How to Avoid Them. So I don't know if you're interested in running a marathon, but if you are or know anybody that is, send this podcast their way, and there will surely be something in here that is valuable to you or one of your friends or family members. These are things that I have learned from my experience training clients who are working on marathons and programming for them, as well as programming for myself when it comes to marathon training. And I've also reviewed quite a bit of literature to create this podcast, as well as create any marathon plans I have done before. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I like looking at research and what has been studied and shown in the available. Please find the show notes for the information with the literature that I have used in this podcast here. I have put those resources in the show notes, and I will give credit where credit's due when I shout out some information today. So without further ado, buckle up and let's get started. So when it comes to marathon training, most runners, endurance runners, marathoners are pretty disciplined. They're willing to put in the work to execute their goal, but discipline applied with the wrong structure leads to burnout, stagnation, and injury. So today, like I said, I'm going through the most common mistakes seen in marathon prep, why they happen physiologically, and what the research says, and what to do instead if you're training for a marathon or coaching someone who is training for a marathon. In this episode, you'll be given a better framework, potentially, for marathon training. Just a reminder, this is a way. The way I program for marathon is a way to program for a marathon. It is not the way. Again, this is just accumulation of common errors I see. Again, there are many ways to work toward a goal, many ways to program for a marathon, many ways to structure a program. It is all dependent on the person, all dependent on what their goals are, all dependent on where they're at, where they're trying to go, and what their regular schedule may allow for. So all those are factors. Again, these are just some overview things to be aware of if someone is prepping for a marathon. Okay, I think that is enough of an introduction there. Let's get into it. So mistake one that I'll point out is building mileage before building capacity. So most traditional marathon plans start with building a aerobic base and building mileage gradually and saving the speed or intervals for later. And again, this is a way to do it. That is not a bad thing per se, but when you're accumulating that aerobic base early on, it may be easy to stack a lot of mileage early on and progress rather quickly, and it might lead to potential injuries, things like that, if your body's not prepared for the mileage. And I also like the concept of building a VO₂max capacity before you get into increasing the mileage and aerobic work there. Of course, aerobic work starts from the get-go because that is the demand you're trying to prep for. That is the adaptation you're trying to build with the marathon program. So of course it's going to be in there, but it should be something that is progressed as time goes on. So the mileage climbs first and intensity comes later in this kind of quote unquote typical model or things that you see often. So again, the problem with this is that this assumes that your aerobic ceiling is already sufficient. So this is a problem because your VO₂max represents your maximum oxygen uptake capacity, and it sets the upper boundary for aerobic performance. Some research done from Bassett and Howley in 2000 shows that endurance performance is influenced by VO₂max, lactate threshold, and running economy as well. So if VO₂max is underdeveloped, the marathon pace becomes a higher percentage of that max capacity, perceived exertion rises, recovery time increases, and cumulative fatigue builds earlier. Another study by Midgley et al. In 2006 revealed that high-intensity interval training, or HIIT training, demonstrate that VO₂max can improve relatively quickly, especially compared to structural tissue adaptations. Rising VO₂max early improves stroke volume, enhances oxygen delivery, improves mitochondrial enzyme activity as well. So, when submaximal aerobic work increases later, it's more efficient. So it makes sense to increase the VO₂max capacity early on, lay that foundation there, and of course continue to progress into the mileage. So how this looks could be introducing controlled short duration, high intensity efforts early, like PCR intervals. So these are very short, high output efforts, usually around 10 seconds or so. This could be sprints or on a bike, just whatever you can to do max output. And you can also do some anaerobic intervals like zone 4 to 5 work there. This doesn't replace the aerobic work early on, like I mentioned, it just complements it. You're doing them concurrently earlier on in the program, and you'll kind of wean out from the intensity and then increase the volume there. So you build the ceiling while building the base. So moving on to mistake number 2, the moderate intensity gray zone, as it's commonly called. So this is one that I see all the time. It's people working out in this quote unquote gray zone, right? They're not doing a lot of that kind of VO2 max capacity training like we just talked about with more of the higher effort intervals, and they're doing maybe not as much as the kind of longer distance aerobic work that they're trying to train for, the adaptation they're trying to build with getting ready for marathon. So this is, you can think of this as a moderately hard pace. It's kind of a Goldilocks just right. It's not too hard, not too easy. It's, people getting out there and going for a run because a certain amount of mileage is in their program, but they're just aimlessly doing it at a pace that they feel like they ought to be going at. So it's done with little intention, right? So I guess this mistake you can also kind of group into unintentional running as well. But I'm calling it the gray zone because it's kind of in the middle. It's not serving a specific purpose within the program itself. So have intention when you're doing your runs and executing your program. So let's talk about some research, shall we? Seiler in 2010 talked about different models with endurance training. So what they found is elite endurance athletes often perform 80% of training at low intensity and 20% at high intensity, and very little in the moderate zone. So this moderate zone being this gray zone, which is the quote unquote mistake number 2 being discussed here in this podcast. And why is this a problem, you might ask? Because moderate intensity elevates stress hormones, doesn't maximize mitochondrial adaptation, interferes with recovery, and the chronic moderate intensity blunts the aerobic gains found in this study here by Seiler in 2010, which if you're interested in learning more, check out the show notes. So how might we fix this issue? So you can kind of distinguish between the two intensities clearly by actually incorporating the zone 2 aerobic base work, as well as some threshold intervals, and you can think of it as zone 3, as well as layering in some zone 4 and 5 work with VO2 specific training, like those anaerobic intervals we talked about that are really high intensity, high output, where you're working hard. So again, there's all these components, right? And a good program will layer these appropriately throughout and progress accordingly. Which, if you are interested in what I consider a good program, check out kingdomstrengthinstitute.com for the marathon program that just recently launched a couple weeks ago. But again, enough of that. You can find it there on the website if you're interested. But you're here for some practical knowledge on marathon training. So let's continue, shall we? Moving on to mistake number 3, which is ignoring strength training. This is another thing I see often where people will, say they're programming or say they're training for a marathon and think they're okay to not hit the gym, hit the weights. And, I guess I could see where this misconception comes from with, I'm training for marathon. Therefore, I'm going to run because that's what I'll be doing in my event, not lifting any weights. So I get you, I see that. But the lifting of weights and putting load on your tissues under range of motion will help support your running. So again, the issue here is your cardiovascular system adapts faster than your connective tissue. And the research with this shows that cardiovascular adaptations can occur within weeks and tendon remodeling can take months. So when mileage increases without strength support, you could accrue some injuries potentially with that increase of volume. For example, shin splints, Achilles tendinopathy, patellar tendon issues. These are common things you may hear with people going through marathon training might experience because their tissues aren't being loaded in the gym, so they can't tolerate the forces that are being accrued during the actual running, right? So these are like load management failures, right? People aren't preparing themselves to handle the load that they're going to be placing on their bodies. So very classic concept with anything, really, with any sort of soft tissue injury. So you can apply this to outside marathon training as well. So let's talk about some literature on strength training for endurance athletes. So there's a study by Yamamoto et al., and Pham, if you will, in 2008, and their research focused on heavy strength training with endurance athletes. And what they found is that strength training paired with their aerobic work can improve the running economy as well as force production and increase time into perceived exhaustion. And that one was interesting to me specifically. So without negatively impacting the VO₂max when programmed correctly with weaving in the strength training, you can potentially increase the economy or form or how you're running to decrease energy expenditure to make your running more effective, which is kind of what this study was saying. So I don't know, interesting stuff, something I hadn't thought too much about before diving into that paper there. So anyway, more about some strength training. The strength training can also improve tendon stiffness, neuromuscular coordination, force absorption, and like we talked about, stride efficiency. And when it comes to the strength training within a marathon program, it ought to be periodized, right? So the strength should evolve across a marathon cycle. So how I program is there's a macro cycle, which is the whole, usually a year if you're a traditional athlete. But again, it's just the whole program pretty much, that whole focus. And again, usually organized by a training year macro cycle. And then you have different mesocycles within the macro cycle. And those you can call like blocks, if you will. These can often be chunked up by months, like say 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. Again, there's so much freedom to program how you want. It is truly an art in many ways to do things. And then there's mesocycles within that. And again, that's just little blocks within the mesocycles. So each mesocycle will have a goal within the macrocycle. So the macrocycle has a set goal that you're working toward, but each of those mesocycle blocks kind of fit in together to work on different things at different times, still progressing to that end goal of the macrocycle, but offloading certain things at certain times, progressing certain things at certain times so that the progressions are made appropriately to consider not getting injured, to consider what may be going on in the athlete's schedule at that time, and to consider the other factors that may be at play in terms of what you're developing. There's different styles of periodization with like linear periodization, undulating periodization. So again, whatever adaptations you're trying to build should be the main focus. But within it, you can build on each other and also weave in deloads, things like that. So I can do another podcast on programming and periodization because it is quite interesting, and it's nothing I want to confuse you on too much right now in this podcast, considering this is specific to marathon training. So we'll save that for another podcast where I can clearly kind of map out more programming principles and maybe discuss how it can be applied to different sort of goals and different style of programs and maybe different kind of athletes as well. So anyway, back to the marathon program when it comes to programming the resistance training. So kind of how I like to do it is you can call it linear periodization in intensity or reverse linear periodization in volume, however you want to think of it, or whatever you prefer to call it. How I like to do it is you start with muscular endurance training early on, and then you get into more hypertrophy, and then strength, and then power and plyometrics kind of stuff, and kind of ending with some isometrics toward the end, more of in like the taper phase of the program. So the idea of this is you're decreasing the intensity of the cardiovascular training and increasing the volume. So that's why we go from a higher volume with your lifting, with your resistance training, and decreasing volume there, increasing intensity with the resistance training and the load in the gym, right? So again, I'll explain that one more time just to be crystal clear. And one way I like to program the resistance training and the cardiovascular training for a marathon program. For the resistance training, I like to start with more volume at the start of the program and end with less volume, higher intensity. So for example, like I said, starting with more endurance training into hypertrophy and strength, and then some like power plyometrics and throwing in some isometrics there at the end. That pairs well with the running volume increasing. So as the running volume increases, which is the demand you're trying to prepare for, to run 26.2 miles, while that is increasing, you're decreasing volume in the gym and increasing strength. And this strength isn't like 1 RMs. It's not you're completely gassing out in the gym. This is just supplementary to what you're doing out there in your runs and your cardiovascular sessions. So hope that makes sense. And you might be asking yourself, okay, why something like power in there too? And this was an interesting note again in literature. With higher mileage reduces neuromuscular stiffness. So with including strength and power in there will preserve tendon spring and mechanical efficiency as well, kind of going back to the conversation about weaving in the strength work. Alrighty. So that was a mouthful there. Hopefully y'all followed that well. I repeated myself a few times because repetition is the mother of learning, and I like to be sure I'm clear in my communication and covering things adequately. Next step is mistake 4, increasing volume without tissue capacity. So the gradual volume progression is key. I like to do around 10 to 15% increases in volume week to week on the actual mileage or cardiovascular training performed. So the progression shouldn't be arbitrary. It should be just enough to challenge you further, but not too much to where you don't have the capacity to handle that demand. Moving on to mistake number 5 with mismanaging the taper. This is something that I get a lot of questions on when it comes to marathon training, is how to taper at the end of the program. So many runners fear losing fitness at the end and find themselves actually running too much at the end of the program. And they're adding just a ton of volume when they ought to be letting their body get ready for the amount of miles they're about to on tapering by Mujica and Padilla in 2003. Again, these studies will be in the show notes. So this study specifically shows that reducing volume while maintaining some intensity preserves aerobic capacity, reduces fatigue, improves performance outcomes. And a good thing to remember is when, say you have a 2-week taper, the taper shouldn't be terribly long. The way I like to do it is the peak mileage around 2 to 3 weeks before the marathon. And I usually don't get up to 26. I'll usually get to like 22 to 24, depending on the person. And again, it can even be a wider range than that if you wish. But getting to that point 2 to 3 weeks before the marathon, and then cutting still keeping a long run and still doing your normal programming, just cutting the amount of volume that you're performing within the couple weeks before. So if you have any questions on that, please feel free to reach out. But I think that covers it pretty well. It's pretty intuitive. You don't want to be running too much right before. Let your body recover. You're not going to lose all the gains that you built within a 2-week period, because it's not like you're doing nothing. You're still going to be running. You're still going to be training. It's just wisely and tapering appropriately and cutting some of that mileage. So let's kind of zoom out and get to the big picture here. The marathon training is about sequence, raising the ceiling, building the base, strengthening the structure, increasing volume progressively, and tapering intelligently. The goal is not to suffer more, challenge yourself more, or to increase mileage at the wazoo, but the goal is to adapt effectively and give your body the opportunity to adapt, and giving your body the opportunity to have the capacity to handle demands you are placing on it and will place on it at the marathon day. So just some parting thoughts. Marathon training requires discipline, it requires consistency, it requires intelligent programming. Consistency is more important than the intensity you're at, more important than, getting everything perfect to a T, right? The structure is important, but give yourself grace as well. Give yourself patience and go out there and crush it if you're listening to this, and you will be running a marathon. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out at coach@Kingdom Strength Institute. And if you found this information helpful, I created a free guide, Common Marathon Training Mistakes and What to Do Instead. If you are interested, again, email me at coach@Kingdom Strength Institute. I also wanted to provide a surprise for anyone who has made it this far into the podcast. The surprise is a discount off the marathon program, the Kingdom Strength Marathon program. So if you're listening, you get 10% off this program. Again, I will direct you to the email coach@kingdomstrengthinstitute.com. Claim your 10% off by emailing that email address. So hope you enjoyed today. I'm so happy you are here, so happy you're listening, and I am praying that you got a lot from this podcast, that you found at least some of it informative, something new, and I would encourage you to lean into the literature that I am going to put in the show notes. I'll make that available for you. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I will catch you next time on the Kingdom Strength Podcast. God bless you.